Borderlands 2 has had a reputation since its release for being one of the greatest looter shooters of the generation, perhaps of all time. Unfortunately, it seems time is not on the series' side, as many have noted that the games have aged poorly, especially in regards to the humor. I've been a huge fan of the Borderlands series since the second game and have well over 1,000 hours in it, so I was worried. Could the game I enjoyed so much at one point really have aged that badly? Will I go back and find a boring game with cringy humor and subpar gameplay? Well, I decided to go back to Borderlands 2 and take a look at everything the game has to offer. And I'd like to take some time to explain to you not just how the game has admittedly changed in the years since, but how it is still as timeless as ever. If Borderlands 2 is indicative of anything, it's how much our standards have changed, not just in regards to humor, but in regards to games as a whole. It's not hard to say the game's perception has changed, but my goal here isn't to view the game through hindsight, lambasting humor that in another 10 years could come back around to being appreciated. My interest will instead be focused on how the game's ideas and themes work within the game itself, because the reality is, even if people these days might not admit it, Borderlands 2 was received kindly when it released, specifically in regards to the humor. But further analysis of the game's mechanics and comedy disconnected from the hype can provide new insight to the discussion around the game, especially in the wake of a third game which some felt is disappointing, and with the new movie that, according to some early screenings, isn't very good. So I want to see, did this game age poorly? My immediate answer is not really, but it's not that simple, and it certainly doesn't extend to just the writing. Many aspects of Borderlands 2 would not be received well today, but I also think that there are tons of aspects that, in spite of its age, are still excellent. Borderlands 2 was highly regarded when it first launched, and I don't think that consensus should change, because even if some of the out-of-context clips can be annoying and some of the jokes are outdated, I think there's a gameplay loop here that is timeless, and had it not been so good, so addictive, so fun, fans would not have been able to hold out as long as they did for Borderlands 3. In terms of a sequel, Borderlands 2 is a masterwork that builds upon every single theme, gameplay element, and plot point presented in the first game. In terms of a standalone product, it still succeeds as being one of the best looter shooters I've ever played. After 12 years, it's time to look back at the game and see if it's still good, still worth the time, and if a decade has really made the experience as unbearable as some parts of the internet might have you believe. And be warned, there's spoilers ahead.
Need a face shot! Boom! Shoot me in the face! In the face!
Borderlands 2 is a game that blew up. Review scores were positive, players were loving it, and the community for the series was reaching new heights. These days, it's easy to look at Borderlands 2 as the game that put the series on the map, but we shouldn't forget that the first Borderlands laid an excellent foundation for the series, selling well and reviewing extremely well too. It was considered wholly unique, and all these years later, I consider it to still be true. The story is definitely lighter and the guns not as numerous, but essentially everything you love about Borderlands 2 is present in the first game to some degree. Once Borderlands released, the game was a surprise success to Gearbox, who at the time were developing a sequel alongside two other projects, Duke Nukem Forever and Aliens Colonial Marines, which, wow, talk about striking gold. Because Borderlands was so successful, Gearbox was able to put even more money into the sequel, and that increased budget is seen everywhere, from its wider, more detailed locales, to the smoother animations, and of course, the gazillion guns. Its main setting is Pandora, a once barren planet that after the events of the first game is seeing new life, prosperity, and exploitation. Hygiene seems to be at a minimum, and the same can be said for food across most of the wastelands. Surely in a land where respawn stations and weapon vending machines exist, we could find some food too, maybe a delivery service like the sponsor of today's video, Factor. Generally speaking, I can be a lazy guy, and cooking takes forever, so I generally find myself having meals that aren't as nutritionally fulfilling, if you know what I mean. And that's because I can't be bothered, or I'd rather spend my time making videos. If you're one of those people that can't find the time for meal prepping, you might like Factor, which offers pre-cooked, chef-made meals delivered straight to your door and are ready within 2 minutes. I love Factor personally as a student because life gets hectic between the channel, tests, papers, and other household activities. So being able to have meals ready to go makes staying productive much easier. I was able to choose on their website the kind of meals I wanted, the allergies I have, and in my case, because they don't yet deliver to Vancouver, which is coming soon, I sent it to a friend who testified that the meals are top-notch. So if you're looking to get high-quality, chef-made meals delivered straight to your door and skip the stress figuring out a meal plan for the week, then head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code AQUA50 to get 50% off your first box and 20% off of your next month of orders. That's code AQUA50 at Factor75 for 50% off your first box plus 20% off your first month of orders. And thank you to Factor for sponsoring this portion of the video. Speaking from experience, marketing for this game was a big reason many bought it, and what Borderlands 2 from the outset told customers was that the humor would be turned up to 11. Borderlands 1 was a funny game, but the tone of the game was far different than the second. The humor of the first game was much darker, less in your face, and often had very disturbing premises. The second game has that, but it's a bit more overt with its punchlines, and to give an example, we can look at TK Baha, a character that is featured in both. In the first game, he gives us a few quests, and later on we're told to go check up on him, and Yeah. What's funny is the way the quest completes itself as you walk in. There's no dialogue, no reaction, just the body. And it's funny because it's completely unexpected, but then it becomes kind of disturbing. In the second game, a similar joke is made when finding his audio logs.
Well, first day on Pandora. Wife's not too happy about the move, but I'm sure things will be all right. This here's the beginning of our new life.
A few moments later.
Well, my wife's dead.
The difference to me is that Borderlands 2 is more clear with the setups and punchlines, or maybe the difference is the more polished world of Borderlands 2, as it affects the actual lens through which I view that humor. Borderlands 2 is a good-looking game, even to this day, because of its unique art style that feels right in the middle of a movie and a comic book. There are semi-realistic textures, but they are also bordered with thick outlines. It's an art style I haven't seen done better elsewhere, and it makes any screenshot of the game identifiable. Of course, this art style isn't new as it was presented in the first game, but in that case, it turned out the way it did because the game's art style had changed last minute, so not everything could be reworked in time, hence the charming clash. In 2, this art style was the goal from the beginning, leading to a lot more synergy and a great sense of identity. UI elements are abundant but with genuinely important information, and the soundtrack for this game is really good, no doubt because of Jesper Kid's presence, who you'll know from making the song Ezio's Family, which would become practically the theme song of the Assassin's Creed series. The first game had slick animations, but 2 stepped up the fluidity of those animations, making them faster, flashier, and it makes a high-octane gameplay look that much better. The only part of this game that has aged poorly, arguably, is the pre-rendered cutscenes, as the compression hasn't looked the best, but at that point we're nitpicking in my opinion. Character designs are well done, with the main cast and antagonist being downright iconic, and all the side characters being wholly unique help make this game as memorable as it can be. Yeah, random Sanctuary Citizen number 42 isn't going to turn any heads, but the amount of times I've seen a random ass electrical box in other games and been like, it's Claptrap, would be enough to have me admitted. Borderlands 2 takes place on the same planet as the first game, and while that does mean it's going to have some reused locations, they feel so different that you would easily mistake it for a completely different location. Characters make a return, and the world building established in the first game is properly built upon here. Pandora has permanently changed since the opening of the vault, with the climate changing, the monsters changing, and while the game does feel like a central location, it also feels disconnected in some ways. Locations are separated by loading screens, but the actual travel time from one location to the next can be a minute, or at times it can be canonically a multiple hour-long drive between locations that otherwise look within walking distance. Regardless, when a world like this feels so well thought out, it allows the player to be more motivated in conquering it, calling it home, staying for a few hours, and maybe a couple more. Plenty of characters are referenced, returning, and even new characters introduced here are given backstories that are properly expanded upon in the prequels, and it makes returning to Borderlands 2 like standing at the center of a web, with the first game, pre-sequel, and 3 being different branches. An important part about enjoying any activity is learning, and on the first playthrough, 3rd, 4th, 5th, I was learning new things and was interested in those revelations. But the part of Borderlands 2 that I love the most is the way it handles myths and larger-than-life ideas. The first game had this in spades. Most of the early game has you helping people find things or killing people, all the while the characters are constantly saying that the vault doesn't exist. 2 can't do that, but it still maintains the sheer awe that players should feel upon entering a vault. The vault itself is incredible, but I want to instead draw your attention to a raid boss called Terramorphous. I'll get more into the gameplay of Terramorphous later, but for now, I want to talk about how you find it. Once the game is completed, you're tasked with going to Thousand Cuts, where you'll see an iridian structure that leads to the raid boss's lair. This is always here, not always accessible, but always visible. When at the bunker, you can see most of Thousand Cuts down below, but you can also see a suspiciously large thresher moving about. That's Terramorphous, and most players would have no idea. I do think, generally, Borderlands 2 is the weakest in terms of how fantastical it can be, and hey, it's at least one point I can give to the pre-sequel, but it still does it very well. And maybe the reason it doesn't feel as otherworldly is because the world that is here is so unique and colorful as it is. Keep in mind, the previous game was mostly desert, arid, badlands, so moving onwards to a game with proper cities, snowfields, flora, tundra is refreshing, and the pace at which these are introduced not only intrigues players, but helps them too. If you're a new player to the Borderlands series, starting with 2, then you'll be in an area where the surrounding landscapes are blues and whites, convenient because it contrasts with the rest of the UI and the enemies to make them easier to see. Borderlands 2 is a game where losing sight of an enemy because of how much is on screen is common, but not in the early game, and I believe that's intentional. Loot boxes are an easy to spot Hyperion yellow, helping aid players who might be looking for ammo in the early game. When constantly opening crates at all times is essential to survival, it's important to build that habit within the player early on. If you're a returning player, there's still something to enjoy here because you're in an area with a complete completely different aesthetic to most of the first game, trading clear skies for northern lights and being introduced to a new enemy class. If there's one thing I can credit Borderlands 2 for, it's the sheer creativity in Pandora. In the first game, Pandora was disconnected in the sense that areas were often literally connected through tunnels or random black voids. In other ways, it was connected by how samey a lot of the environments looked. The arid Badlands don't look very different from the Rust. Borderlands 2 could feel disconnected by the diversity in environments, but they all make logical sense and aren't always gated by random pipes and tunnels. Once Sanctuary enters the sky, if you go back to its previous location, you'll find an entire underground area that has now been exposed. There's a logical reason for this area to be here, and so, despite how different it is to nearly everything the player would see up to that point, it makes sense. Tundra Express shows this off even more. We have seemingly random areas of snow, then gravel right next to one another, but the world surrounding this shows that the thawed areas are where there are factories or other heat-exuding structures, so an area like this can be diverse, but not at the sacrifice of believability. Of course, a game with magic sirens and ancient warriors doesn't need to maintain realism per se, but the consistency is appreciated. Sound design is important for immersion, but also for satisfaction. Part of why skills like bore or amp shields are so fun is because the associated sound is just music to my ears, even if it eventually becomes loud as hell. These days, the feel of the guns isn't rivaling Borderlands 3 or really any shooter, but for the time it felt great, and even to this day I never felt like it was primitive by modern standards. Enemies sound great, all the way from the hilarious bruisers to the midgets. The many midget jokes are some parts of the game that to me have aged quite poorly, and might even be seen as offensive, along with other rather crude instances. But I think it's important to remember the times when these games were released. Jokes like these were commonplace, and while that doesn't retroactively make them acceptable by today's standards, I think it's hard to hold it against the game. Games are art, and thus are inherently reflective of the society and even small communities in which they are made. We can still appreciate that art while acknowledging its missteps. When exploring Pandora, I never once felt like my curiosity wasn't rewarded. Most times the reward was tangible, like a weapon or some enemies, but just as often I was rewarded with a story told through the surroundings, or one of many Easter eggs. I'm sure you've all seen the Minecraft Easter egg, and that's just one example of a secret being in the world to reward the players for just looking around. Obviously, not all corners of an area will have that large of a payoff, but the point is that these moments, no matter how large or insignificant, were enough to keep me poking around, because there's always a chance it could lead to something really cool. The side quests, in a world sense, follow a similar suit. Many quests in the first game saw you collecting logs, destroying objects, or killing enemies for a bit of lore without much else to keep you motivated outside of the experience gain. Here, we get more dialogue to fill the air, we get better rewards, and while that still doesn't mean every quest is going to be a 10 out of 10, many were. To look at a poor example, there is a side quest for Sir Hammerlock, a hunter, who's trying to come up with a new name for the new class of enemies, Bullymongs. He tries a few names that all get shot down, and eventually gives up and says this.
Bloody balls! What of all his trademarks? Ugh, sod it. I'm so sick of coming up with names for, you know what? Bonafart. All of them. That's right, we're calling them Bonafarts now. Just kill a few of them or something, I don't care anymore.
I'm aware this is by no means highbrow humor, but I gotta admit, it was kinda humorous seeing the actual names of the enemies change. The problem is that, by the time you get this quest, you'll be fighting boner farts that are a significantly lower level, meaning the experience they give is puny. The quest reward itself is also dull, so while it got a solid nose exhale out of me, that's not enough to make this a quest I can't wait to get back to. One of the better ones was a string of cult-related quests, where we need to help Lilith deal with the fallout of her time as a Firehawk. We get to learn about what she's done between the first game and now. We get some fun gameplay mix-ups, and the reward is more than worth the effort. Where Pandora succeeds most is in how fleshed out the world is. If you only complete the main quest, you'll get an idea of what Pandora is and how it got there, but the audio logs offer plenty of insight into new and old characters, how certain areas came to be, and just general stories of how beautiful yet unforgiving the world is. One of the early side quests sees you collecting audio logs that explains what happens to Helena Pierce, a character from the first game. Players who remember her will be able to find out what happened to her in between the events of Borderlands 1 and 2. If you don't know who this character is, then it doesn't matter, because what these tapes also do is introduce Handsome Jack in a more formal way.
This train was commandeered legally under the...
Holy nutballs! What happened to your freaking face?
Every piece of world building, audio log, or character is interesting for both new and veteran players, which is something few games are able to provide. World building in a game like Borderlands is important because the intrigue of exploring new areas and finding out more about the land can pick up the slack during the admittedly rare moments of downtime in the gameplay, which, let's be real, is where this game has barely aged. gameplay in Borderlands 2 is complicated for me to explain because I genuinely haven't enjoyed a looter shooter as much as I have this game, and I, until now, never questioned why. In the early weeks of my initial obsession, I was convinced it was the comedy, the story, the music, something in front of me. But that just isn't true. A majority of the time I spent with this game was farming bosses, clearing the same areas and enemies over and over with no new dialogue, no harmonies unheard. The once dynamic particles and explosions have become part of a script that I've memorized, and yet I still like it. Yes, there are no longer any surprises, and the beginning parts of the game are where it drags the most, but I think what keeps the game continually interesting is the diversity in builds, methods, guns, and the general game of chance. Borderlands 2 at its core is a gambling game, and I know that sounds stupid as hell, so bear with me here. Chance plays a role in everything. There are some consistencies: the enemies, the skills, the environments, the finite number of weapons, even if that finite number is unreasonably large. Everything else is completely random, and when the weapons you use are the focus of the game, everything weapon related being a game of chance makes every situation one where you're gambling. This all stems from the loot system, which essentially randomizes every single thing an enemy, boss, chest, ammo crate, toilet, or quest can give you. According to the promotional material, there are a lot of guns in this game, over 2 million for sure. Now, that doesn't translate to gameplay because there's a difference between the most common slop that'll just be traded for cash and the actual loot that works itself into your arsenal. But the idea remains. The chances of finding the exact same gun in the wild back to back is exceedingly rare. Even when fighting the same enemy who drops the same kind of weapon, you will still struggle to get a duplicate without many hours of grinding. Borderlands 2 is at its best when like a slot machine. They're constantly pulling that lever and rolling for a jackpot. But there are different layers to this game of chance that are important to unpack, because it is what separates the casuals from the real addicts. In the early game, players are less concerned with what they want and more with what they need. Color isn't a factor. Instead, it's about what guns match their level and thus will do the most base damage. Everything is new to you, so you'll take what you can get, swapping out weapons for others that look cooler than the one you have, or one that simply has more green arrows in comparison to your current weapon. After about an hour, you'll have tried a few different weapons and will now start developing preferences not just for the guns you like, but what playstyles you'd like. Someone wanting to play a ranged class will be praying for enemies to drop different snipers, and one who wants to create as much flashy chaos as possible will get a rush of adrenaline every time a new shiny bazooka drops. Personally, I like elemental damage and semi-automatics, so my preferred weapons are submachine guns and pistols with a sprinkle of snipers in there too. These SMGs offer high fire rate, allowing me to hit an enemy with a status effect efficiently, and the single fire weapons work well for me on the computer because I'm not very good at tracking enemies. Once you get familiar with the classes, you'll be finding yourself preferring a brand of weapon. Maybe you prefer torque weapons, which fire small rockets instead of bullets, offering high damage and stagger, but not much in the way of accuracy or fire rate. Or how about bandit weapons, which often are the most run-of-the-mill weapons? They offer a classic feel that players familiar with games like Call of Duty won't have issues getting the hang of. Now by the mid-game, you're starting to notice some patterns. Robots are weak to corrosive, shields are weak to electricity, and flesh is weak to fire. So using weapons of that elemental variety will be most effective, especially when entering the mid-game where enemies become tougher. Also, really neat that knowing what element to use for what is simplified by the health bars of the enemies matching the color of the element they're weak to. Any health bar in red will be weak to fire, and the same goes for the other elements. Now, when in a part of the story where robots are more common, you'll be scrounging around for a corrosive weapon. And when the enemies are beasts, you'll be looking for fire, and by the end of the game, you'll be looking to fill weaknesses in your loadout. Chances are, at the end of your first playthrough, you'll have an inventory with little synergy. When I finished, I had a gun that I simply liked the look of, a gun to apply elemental effects, and one that did significant damage. I didn't always use these weapons in tandem, but the game never asked me to. Then, once the final boss is defeated, we get a message that says you can do true Vault Hunter mode. Level up more, find better loot, take on harder enemies. Now I know, this text seems a little exaggerative. You mean to tell me the real game begins now? Hell, True Vault Hunter mode just encourages player to synergize their loadout more, get more elemental damage in, and really start thinking about how their skills interact with their guns. The loot, aside from it being of a higher level, is the same deal. The enemies get harder, so you're scrounging around for higher level guns to get by. Generally, weapon rarity plays a larger role here too, as the rarer the gun, the better it is. So now we're seeing a clear divide between guns that are immediately sold for cash and others that are actually used. The game is clearly lying by saying the real game begins on True Vault Hunter mode too, because it actually starts in Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, specifically at the end of that playthrough once you've hit the maximum level of 80. If you thought enemies in TVHM were hard, UVHM is here to say hold my beer and hold this L, because in this mode most enemies take you down in just a few shots. Enemies are more accurate, they have more health, and otherwise outclass you in every single way. Elemental damage, skill synergy, cooperation, proper ability cycling, resource management is not simply a requisite to success, it's a requisite for survival. By looking at the gameplay, specifically at how much I'm dying on screen, it's easy easy to say that this is an unbalanced mode, but this cannot be further from the truth, because this mode is specifically tuned around you playing at your best. Every class can succeed at this difficulty. Not every gun, but every class, and once you hit that max level, you aren't done, because now you can really start fine-tuning a build. Yeah, we got the experience, we got the skills, we got the guns, but, well, do we really have the guns? Because even though at UVHM the pool of weapons you'll be using is significantly smaller, you'll now be obsessing over the little details and farming for different variants of the same gun, rolling the dice each time you grind a boss. This is because each gun is made of different parts by different manufacturers. Bandit, Dahl, Hyperion, Jacobs, Maliwan, Tediore, Torg, and Vladoff. Each manufacturer specializes in certain strengths and weaknesses. Each gun has parts, like the body, grip, sights, barrel, stock, accessories, and so on. The body of the gun will determine what the manufacturer is, and from there, all the different parts will grant different buffs and debuffs depending on what manufacturer made that part. If an individual part is the same manufacturer as the body, then you'll get an even greater bonus. So now, beyond getting a specific gun, you now have different parts for that gun that offers a bunch of different bonuses, and we're approaching a cliff here. I can either dive off and go deeper and explain the specific benefits and challenges to using each part, or explain why you would need one over the other, but that isn't the point. Borderlands 2 has a stupid number of guns, and the point of getting this deep into the technical aspect of it is to give you an idea of how truly no gun is the same, and thus no playthrough is the same. If I play the game using a pistol that has great accuracy, I can reliably play from farther away. If on another playthrough I somehow find the exact same pistol except now it has a blade at the end of it and is less accurate with the benefit of a higher fire rate, the way I need to play and get the most out of that pistol is completely changed. As you play, you develop preferences, and thus the parameters for hitting the jackpot continually shifts. At level 1, the jackpot is a weapon that's much better than the one you have equipped. At level 20, it's a weapon that has the strengths needed for your current situation. By 50, a jackpot is a legendary, and by level 80, it's finding a hyper-specific variant of the gun you want, and no other reward matters. Now you might be in awe at this, because as far as I know, Borderlands is the only series to require a fucking doctorate to understand the different weapon variants, but guess what? No, come here, guess what? This is just the guns. Every single shield has 4 parts that influence its stats, every grenade is made of 5 parts, and even the class mods have variants, so the possibilities are not endless, okay? And technically speaking, it is quantifiable just how many different ways you can approach a situation, but this is simply a means of saying that the loot here is the heart of the game, and somehow, Gearbox was able to make all of these guns at some point in a person's playthrough of value, whether through damage, selling them for cash, or some other benefit of which there are too many to list. To zoom back out a bit, okay, I'm gonna calm down, back to my favorite general topic of gambling. When the rewards are always new, the player is always experiencing something new. And when each win and loss is unique, the desire to continue that game of chance is heightened. Now, it may seem strange to make this gambling comparison because truthfully, every game has a semblance of chance. Loot isn't unique to Borderlands. Games where opening a chest either yields ammo or guns isn't unique either. And simple variety isn't enough, but it's the consistent quality of the gameplay that's built upon it that makes it enjoyable. In this case, one could say Borderlands 2 is aged poorly, because these days, it seems any game with damage numbers, large skill trees, and massive loot pools is a sign of infection that kills the game before it launches. God, I know this is a dead horse, but games like Suicide Squad and Avengers aren't failures because of their loot systems and damage numbers. They failed because the systems built on top of the loot were poor. While from the trailers, the sight of damage numbers and gears put people off of Suicide Squad, the criticisms of the game when it came out were the story and gameplay, not the loot. In fact, in Suicide Squad's case, the loot was one of the many things noted as being pretty decent, myself included. So when we look at games like Borderlands 2, we have to look at a game as more than the story it presents. And that's not because the story is bad. Hell, the story is good enough that even on my 20th playthrough, I still giggled a few times, but because the end of the story is simply the end of the first act of the game at large. The entire first playthrough is meant to entertain you and get you familiar with the grind, giving you a taste of the tantalizing adrenaline that floods your system when a coveted orange item drops to the ground. Everything past that is a grind, and the grind needs to be fun because the conclusion isn't set. On some characters, I simply get to the max level and stop it there, or I continue my journey by joining others and helping them farm bosses or whip out characters for a new playthrough with my friends. The story of your journey in the endgame is entirely dictated by you because it truly is about the journey more than it is the destination. Everything from the overarching goal of reaching max level, getting certain gear, is peppered with moments where we eagerly anticipate an enemy dropping loot or a chest opening to present us our next favorite gun. Maybe it isn't even that deep. Maybe this rolling of the dice isn't just to win. Maybe it's about getting stronger. Pandora is a world I wanted to stand on top of, with creatures I want wanted to best and people I wanted to put in the ground, like Tiny Tina, you fucking to give credit where it's due. The only reason Borderlands 2 has such a good world is because of the work that Borderlands 1 did. The first game did a lot of great world building through different side quests and main quests, and a lot of the payoffs from the first game act as setups in retrospect when we see how this game builds upon the first. It's not simply returning characters, but it's new locations, the deeper color palettes, and the returning locations that show us just in real time how much the world has changed, and potentially just how small it is. I mentioned that the first playthrough primes you for getting addicted to the grind, and one of the ways Borderlands does this is by giving you a freebie. If you're like me, then on your first playthrough, you did not encounter any legendaries. Side note, on the playthrough I recorded for this, the one you're seeing, I got stupid lucky, so just ignore the footage for a bit. The point is, some players might not, so to speak, win big, so the game makes sure that a legendary guaranteed drops from the final boss the first time you kill it. This is so every player gets the rush of encountering a legendary, and they get to experience how good those guns are, which will get them hooked and looking for another. Every major boss or otherwise major enemy that drops a unique weapon can be refought after you complete whatever quest is associated with them. This leads to a cycle of entering an area, killing the boss, seeing what you get, quit out, reload, and do it all again. And I think I can speak for most people when I say that this is where a majority of the hardcore Borderlands fans' time is spent. World building, dialogue, none of that matters when you're in the grind. And so the mechanics are given time to shine. Much like the looting, there are plenty of moments in the game where chance plays a role, and not often in a way that can skew in your favor, nor in a way that feels counterintuitive. Gunplay feels great here. Every gun has noticeable knockback, and bullets always feel like they connect with enemies realistically. The variety of guns does a lot of heavy lifting here because sometimes the bullets are classic bullets, sometimes small rockets, balls of plasma, and so on. So the gameplay itself changes based on the gun you're using. What's important then is consistency. When guns always work, when the AI is consistent, when there are dependable aspects of the game, I am never left feeling cheated when luck doesn't go my way. Because the truth is, in every case where I died, I felt like there was something I could have done to have prevented it. Truth be told, good gunplay is something I take for granted these days, because it is simply something that needs to not be noticed. Shooting, reloading, swapping weapons, throwing grenades all needs to become as automatic as breathing, because without it, the game dies. I'm going to talk about the structure of the game, the enemies and bosses it throws at you, and general gameplay quirks I found interesting, but please remember, the only reason we can appreciate this stuff so much is because the gunplay that is by all means foundational is consistent, and that value cannot be understated. The enemy variety plays a large role in how fun the game is. The first Borderlands had variety too, but the cast is expanded even further here with the additions of enemies like Goliaths and Hyperion robots. A Goliath will wear a helmet, and if the helmet is shot off, the Goliath will enter an enraged state, attacking the nearest enemy or player. If the Goliath kills an enemy, it'll power up, which is an interesting mix-up for a few reasons. First is that, if you want to play it safe, you can rely on headshots to quickly finish the job, but if you want to engage with a bit of gambling, you can pop off the helmet and see if the Goliath can take down a few enemies for you. If they take down enough though, they might be too powerful for you to stop. Goliaths aim to pad out the bandit class of enemies and do so well, but there's also a whole new class in the Hyperion loaders. These loaders have weak points on their eye, which is small and difficult to hit, but the joints connecting their arms to their torso are weak spots that reward players with boosted damage and dismemberment. Loaders will show up with guns in their hand, and if you shoot off the arm that holds the gun, you've made taking them down much easier. It's so satisfying to slowly turn a robot into a doormat by shooting off individual limbs, and the fact that there's even a tactical advantage makes it even better. EXP loaders will charge you and explode, so shooting their legs will give you more time to plan. Hot loaders fire with their right arm and gun loaders with their left, so memorizing which arms to shoot will maximize efficiency. Wardens are mini bosses of sorts that have large weak spots on their eye and are generally immobile, but their damage output is no joke. As long as you keep moving, you'll be fine, which is generally the case for all enemies, which brings me to another new enemy class, the Threshers. Threshers are creatures that move underground, poking above to do damage, and there are variants that either do ranged or melee damage. But then there are the Wormhole Threshers, which will do an attack that sucks you into their position from a significant distance and won't let go for a few seconds. This is the only enemy in the base game that I dislike. It takes away the one means of defense you have, movement, and because your character is violently shaking and has purple effects crowding the screen, it's difficult to see as well. I think an enemy like this could be improved by decreasing how close the Thresher brings you and decreasing the visual noise. But there's so many enemies to choose from here that if it was taken out of the game completely, I don't think anybody would notice. Enemies have general archetypes that transcend their class. You'll commonly find enemies that are melee based, whether Hyperion engineers or psychos. You'll find heat based enemies, whether pyrotechnics or hot loaders. So even when a new enemy is thrown your way, you never feel like you're completely out to the skags. It's easy to say that the enemies were balanced well, and I don't think there were any that did too much damage or took too much. Instead, some of the enemies are downright annoying. Any flying enemy has always been a pain for a few reasons. The first is that they're hard to kill, but also because they add a level of verticality that feels annoying to keep track of. Racks are a great example because yes, they are made of glass and don't do a ton of damage, but the fact that mid-fight they can just aggro from the sky, come down, block vision, push you around, and essentially through annoyance alone jump to the top of the priority list feels a bit much. The same goes for buzzards, which do have a trick to them. If you shoot their jets, they'll go down faster. But their issue is the AI, as it has a tendency to run away whenever it feels like it, which gets in the way of a crucial mechanic, Second Wind. Second Wind is a genius idea because it directly solves an issue created by the constant variables around you. What if you get unlucky? You miss all your shots, you didn't find the ammo you need, or hell, maybe your shield that has a chance to mitigate some damage decided not to mitigate for a full minute. I'd say losing progress because of luck, even if it's rare, would be enough to severely bring down the experience. However, instead of simply dying when you reach 0 health, you enter a down state called Fight for Your Life. In this state, a player can revive you, or you can kill an enemy in order to get a second wind, which picks you back up and refills your shields. With this mechanic, if you simply get unlucky, you have a chance to still persevere. If you keep getting downed back to back, the time you have in Fight for Your Life will keep getting reduced until you die almost instantly. And this is a smart way of making sure that if a player dies, it is reasonably their fault. Realistically, if you get downed more than twice in a row, there's an issue with strategy or DPS. The only time I found an issue with Fight for Your Life is again with flying enemies, as they are more likely to have considerable distance and thus are more difficult to hit as you can only fire from the hip while downed. Bandits too can sometimes get in your face, down you, and then walk away behind cover, but this happened rarely compared to the buzzards, which seem to do this more often than not. What Fight for Your Life also introduced is clutch moments, where the player is on the back foot, almost down, but they get a lucky kill and are right back in the fight. Combine this with the flashy text and ear candy sound effects and we get easy adrenaline for even the simplest of encounters. Boss fights are designed around this too, as weak enemies will litter most arenas. If you get tripped up by an attack or are still learning the boss, you're given a few weak enemies to get you back in the fight. By now, you're likely realizing that I haven't touched on arguably the most important part of the gameplay, which is the different classes and action skills. On launch, there were 4 different classes to choose from. The Commando, who can summon a turret to help him fight, the Assassin, who specializes in single target combat through deception, which sees him sending out a hologram of himself as he goes invisible, the Gunzerker, who focuses on pure damage output, and the Siren, which generally functions as a support class. Talking about the different classes is difficult because even in the very basic rundown of the classes, I was technically wrong. Players can spec out these classes to be mostly whatever they want them to be. In my case, I took the Siren class and built it out to be reliant on the elemental effects caused by the phase lock. When phase locking someone, I was able to pull other people into that phase lock and then inflict them with different status effects. In my playthrough, this was unbelievably busted because I could put everyone in the same spot and then toss a grenade to wipe out patrols before they even got their chance to fire back. In multiplayer, I respec'd into a wider support role that allowed my entire team to get buffed when I used the phase lock, and I was capable of using phase lock on my friends, which revived them from a massive distance. Admittedly, by the time you reach the level cap, you can dip your toes into a few different builds at once, but these builds don't stop at the abilities. In my case, because I was kitted out for support in multiplayer, when my friends and I were doing raid bosses, we would have him taking the brunt of the damage while I sat back and did damage with my B shield, which I'm going to explain only because it plays a role in nearly every build I use. The B is a legendary amp shield. Amp shields allow your gun to do boosted damage when a shield is full at the cost of some of your shield. The B has no amp shot drain, meaning as long as your shield is full, you can buff the living hell out of your bullets. Guns that fire multiple bullets benefit the most from this, as each individual pellet is given the damage boost. On my first playthrough, I had the B and a gun called the Fibber, which if shot at a surface will ricochet into smaller pellets. The B amplifies the damage of all those ricocheted pellets, meaning the final boss went something like this. Another ideal weapon to pair this shield with is a gun called the Sandhawk, which fires waves of pellets that again are all boosted, and you'll be seeing that gun plenty too. Truthfully, if I tried to explain even the top 10 builds in the game, we'd be here all day. But instead, I want to make a point that these classes all offer different ways to play the game, and the game is properly balanced around them. Personally, I think the Gunzerker is probably the best class and the Commando is the worst, but even then, all are capable of being viable with the right build, the right weapons, and the right player. I have over 1,000 hours in the game, and I've leveled every character except Krieg, sorry buddy, to max level. And the reason I was okay with replaying the same game over and over is that these different classes fundamentally changed the gameplay so much that it felt like a whole new game. What further helps is that the missions here deviate plenty from the basic gunplay, allowing a playthrough to never fall into tedium unless your goal is to farm the same bosses over and over again. The story missions will be the ones to bring you to new areas, have you meet important characters, and generally show you the world of Pandora. The side missions are fun distractions that not only entertain through mechanical mix-ups, but also teach you the history of Pandora. I believe the real strength of the mission design here is that while on paper, you are just shooting people, the context is different, the guns are different, the environments, the excuses, the enemies, there's so much variance, and as showcased by the different enemy classes, meaningful variance, that it's hard to complain when a mission is simply go gather 4 audio logs. Especially considering how these different missions are mostly rewarding you with meaningful gear, the motivation to complete them satisfies both intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. Of course, we're ignoring the writing that is at the heart of most missions, and is certainly the catalyst for the new wave of people calling the game poorly aged. I'll admit that Borderlands definitely has a style of humor that is of its time, but I think once you're in the game, once you've immersed yourself into the world, and once you've come to terms with the humor just being the way it is, I think you'll find yourself, like me, enjoying the ride for what it is. And even after 20 playthroughs, there are still some jokes that kill me, man.
Could I have a refund, please? This gun doesn't seem to work.
I don't know. Looks like it works to me.
The story itself is good too, and while the praises for Handsome Jack have been entirely driven into the ground, I think many people miss what made him so good, which is that Handsome Jack is a legitimate threat, that loses not because of stupidity or ego, but simply because he's not the hero. Borderlands 2 is a story that works so well because it feels consequential. Part of this is from the consequences of the story here, but more importantly, so many events from the first game have direct consequences on Pandora and locations here that it sets a standard. What happens here matters. To go back to Helena Pierce in the first game, she was a significant figure, and while she isn't present here, there is a fast travel station and sanctuary in her honor. Borderlands 2 is one of the few games where by the end I had no questions, no confusion, and that isn't because the story is simple, but because all the crucial details are communicated effectively. The only criticism I could levy against the story is the opening, because it is on rails as it should be, but it also operates at odds with the game as a whole. The story is what will get you through the first playthrough, and it's meant to, at the risk of being disgustingly reductive, jingle keys in your face while you get subconsciously addicted to the grind. If Borderlands 2 didn't want you to replay the story at least 3 times before reaching max level, they would have added more ways for you to level up outside of that story. So when returning for the third playthrough, there's a lot of foot tapping, watch checking, and general boredom as we wait for Claptrap to finish dialogue I know by heart by now. It's not until Liarsburg that the game really opens up, and again, I understand why. We need to set up the story properly, especially for new players, but I would have appreciated an option to skip the intro, start at mission 3 for repeat playthroughs. For now, we can leave that criticism on the back burner because credit where it's due, this intro is well done. The opening cutscene presents the characters, lore, and villains well, while keeping a generally serious tone. Something many forgot about Borderlands 2 is that the humor here works well because the game knows when to let up. Dramatic moments are allowed to marinate, and characters don't bloat otherwise poignant moments with jokes. I feel this is something other modern games have struggled with, and that's because humor is easier when it's shocking. Shock humor is often associated with the grotesque, or the idea of, they just said what they weren't supposed to. But really, shock humor can also be achieved through juxtaposition. Having a character interrupt a dramatic moment with a witty one-liner is shocking because we aren't expecting humor in an otherwise serious moment. This kind of shock humor doesn't often work because it's at the expense of a more important moment, and once you zoom out, you'll see the story as a whole suffer for it. Borderlands 2 does not fall into this trap, and thus its near non-stop onslaught of humor lands more often than not. Characters are given time to breathe, which works in the story's favor. Claptrap is a goofy little guy, for sure, but the moment he becomes grating, we're introduced to Hammerlock, who acts in opposition to him. We get absurd poshness in the face of absurd silliness, and that dynamic works well for the introduction. As we make our way to Captain Flint in an attempt to get off the island, we're introduced over the Echo Communications Network, or as I'll just be referring to it, a radio, to Handsome Jack, and fuck me, where do we start? Handsome Jack is an interesting villain because for all his strengths, he is barely physically present in the game. We only come face to face with him a few times, and when we do, things don't end well for us. What makes Jack stand out from other villains is that he's just fun. Not funny all the time, I'll admit the butt stallion joke is stupid, but that's also part of the charm. Especially in the early game where he doesn't see you as a threat, he's toying with you, and these jokes, the snide remarks, they all have this patronizing tone that makes it fun to hate. Plus, he does actually have plenty of really funny lines.
Right, Dave? Been pretty good. Just bought a pony made of diamonds. Yeah, because I'm rich. So, you know, that's cool. Goodbye.
His constant badgering over the radio is an acceptable substitute for in-person encounters because his influence is seen across Pandora. All of the Hyperion logos are him, all of the parts of the planet opened up by the excavators and drills are his doing, and each win against him, like killing Wilhelm, feel impactful because those assets are built up as being important not to him personally, but to his goal. Our motivation to get Jack isn't because he's the bad guy, it's because he's looking for the vault and so are we. That motivation does change as the story goes on, but the initial competitive fire is what carries our motivation early on. What also also makes Jack one of the better villains is his intellect. He doesn't show up just to taunt you, hell, he doesn't even show up to stop you. And that's respectable because if his boss fight is anything to go off of, the guy goes down pretty quick. He does this because he's constantly toiling in the background. Jack even says this to you.
Handsome Jack here, reminding you all not to worry your pretty little heads about those earthquakes. See, with every tremor, my drill gets closer to the vault, to freedom, order, and safety for us all. Except to you assets in Sanctuary.
Jack has an army behind him and he knows it, so he doesn't need to be in your face, and if his plan is fulfilled, the warrior will defeat any opposition. Now, this is discredited by the gameplay because the warrior went down easy, and even Wilhelm, who was built up for most of the game too, goes down before the characters can even finish telling you to run away because he's too strong. Granted, there are cut audio logs that state Wilhelm was poisoned as Jack wanted the Vault Hunters to get the new core for Sanctuary and not think twice about plugging it in, but that isn't in the game, so most players aren't going to see that. The point is, when Jack isn't showing up often, it gives him the ability to be above the player without being undermined by any boss fight, and he is justifiably preoccupied. As I speak about the different strengths and weaknesses, you'll notice I'm citing audio logs or information you'd find in side quests, and while it is unfortunate that so much context is left to those side missions, I think it's excusable because those side missions need to be completed in order to stay on level with the main story, and as stated, the rewards are quite good. Those side quests flesh out the world, and pacing-wise usually aid the story. When going through the game and skipping the side quests, things happen quickly. When Lilith returns, the Firehawk thing is dropped right away, but if doing the side quests, we get more context for what Lilith was doing and we wrap up the Firehawk quest in a satisfying way. The same goes for any major events. Anytime a beloved character dies, the main quest just keeps moving, but there are plenty of side quests that delve into it more, fleshing out the event more and making the grieving process realistically longer. These side quests also offer moments of levity where the main plot might not be able to fit it in. Continuing with the shock humor, we get lots of randomness in the humor. When exploring Thousand Cuts, having to fight through hordes of bandits, we come across a character named Shooty McShootface, who, as everything around the quest would imply, wants to be shot in the face. I see this clip posted many times as proof that the game's humor is cringe, and yeah, on paper, this joke is unbelievably stupid, but you have to remember that this joke will only be experienced within the context of the rest of the game, the surrounding environment, plot, everything. When we take a joke like this out of context, we're removing the setup, and when we simply present the punchline, yeah, the joke is gonna seem bad because it is incomplete. The relative normalcy leading to the joke is the punchline. It's kind of like when I throw in random clips of myself doing a cappella sea shanties or songs in videos. The reason they're funny is because it's so out of left field in the context of an otherwise semi-serious video. I guarantee you, the moment those clips make it to Twitter without context, people will say it's cringe, and you know what? Fuck it. I would rather a game like Borderlands do something cringy and fall flat on its face than do nothing at all. Plus, these are only the quote-unquote bad jokes. The good jokes hit every single playthrough. After working through waves of bandits, we get a final sarcastic bandit that is slow clapping as we enjoy our victory. Moments like this are so funny to me, and of course we can't talk about the best moments without talking about Jack. After Roland eventually dies, Jack calls you and does this.
Hey buddy, it's me Roland. Let's kill Handsome Jack and then we'll all go out for milkshakes. No, I'm just playing, he's still really dead. Grabbed his echo unit when I left.
This gets me every single time. These gags aren't exclusive to the main quests too, as side quests get their share of hilarity, at times at the player's expense. Halfway through the game we get word of a gun called the Bane. After tracking it down, hearing of how it drove all of its owners mad, finally digging it up, we get to use it, and it turns out it's just a shit gun. It slows your movement speed, it's inaccurate as hell, and every single bullet fired is accompanied by screams, which ignore sound settings, so it can't be turned off. Was I disappointed in not getting a good reward? Yeah, but the real reward? Telling my friends to go get the Bane and hyping it up like the best gun in the game just to keep the joke going. I'm picking the standout examples here, but most of the jokes fall somewhere in the middle. And of course, it's heavily subjective. If you don't find a joke funny, nothing will change that, but I think you owe it to yourself and the art you're critiquing to at least see those jokes within the intended context. But as I say that, no context in the world could save me from how much I fucking hate Tiny Tina. First, let's catch you up to speed. Once dealing with Flint, we go to Sanctuary to meet up with the Crimson Raiders, but their leader, Roland, has gone missing. We help the people first by getting a new power core to keep Sanctuary's shield active, or else Handsome Jack would attack the city. We enlist the help of the Firehawk, Lilith, to find Roland, and when we do, we decide to plan a heist to intercept the vault key that's on a train passing through Tundra Express. In order to get those explosives, Roland introduces us to none other than Tiny Tina. Look, actually, I'm really conflicted on Tina because on one hand, she annoys the shit out of me, makes me cringe, and I would generally be a happier person if her mouth was sewn shut, but on the other hand, I kind of enjoy hating her. She reminds me of an annoying little sister that pisses you you off all the time, but in an endearing way. Tina is also only dealt with for half an hour at most, so her short bursts make her much more tolerable. If we're looking at what parts of the game have aged the worst, Tina is near the top. But that's a great thing, because she really isn't that bad, and 10 years ago, I liked the character much more. Granted, I was 14, so grain of salt and all. Where the game has aged much better is in the way it builds up characters, not just Jack, but in this case, Wilhelm. As you play the game, you'll hear about Wilhelm, and each time you do, characters say that he is unstoppable. He's Handsome Jack's right-hand man, and once we see that he's on the train guarding the vault key, I was very much intimidated, especially as the characters were radioing in telling us to turn away. As mentioned, this is soured by him going down like a baby back bitch, but whatever, let's just move on. We don't find the vault key, but we do find a new core for Sanctuary, and once we plug it in, Handsome Jack tells us a secret he's been keeping, which is that the new core we plugged in can be remote activated by Jack and Angel, leaving Sanctuary exposed. This twist is so expertly executed that I can't help but appreciate it each time, and it's the perfect testament to Jack's intelligence, because had the last few events gone any differently, the plan would have failed. If Wilhelm kills the Vault Hunter, then they don't get the core. If no one is guarding the core, then the team would be rightfully suspicious of it. It's a twist that makes perfect sense, and yet doesn't insult the intelligence of either party involved, which many twists like this run the risk of doing. What's more, Jack is building up to this for the entire game, but holding his tongue until the right moment. At this point, the story begins to take a more direct approach to Jack. The opening follows a consistent pattern of heading to a new location, meeting a new character, doing some side missions for them, and so on. The excuses for this are fine enough, like needing a bandit vehicle to disguise yourself. It justifies the player going to the dust, meeting Ellie, and the reward is a vehicle that can seat 4 players, as a starting vehicle only seats 2. These side tangents don't often last long, however I found myself being increasingly irritated with the side tangents as they went forward, and their excuses became way flimsier. The game hits a good stride once you return to Sanctuary. We get the objective of reaching Angel, the siren communicating with you from the first game who turned out to be working for Jack the entire time, and this is another twist that generally makes sense, but I've already made that point. The new point is, this overarching goal is split into smaller tasks. We need an upgrade for Claptrap so he can get past and disable the Hyperion wall, we need the help of bandits to get past the bunker, and we need a way to make our voice sound like Jack's so we can get past a bioscanner. Each of these missions is completed within one chapter, and thus each step in the process feels like a big accomplishment. This culminates in arriving at and defeating the bunker, where we finally meet Handsome Jack face to face after defeating Angel, his daughter.
I'm going after Jack. Son.
It's at this point the story begins to slow down, and on one hand, maybe you like how the game gives you time to breathe, but for me, I was like, fuck, let's just get it going again, I want to see where this goes. Arriving at Iridium Blight gives an immediate feeling of finality, and it's through there that we have to go to the arid Badlands, but before we can get there, the bridge raises and our new goal is to go get some explosives to blow it up and lower it. Brother, I have an entire military in my pocket, why the fuck do we need this? The answer is the game falling into its old routine of pushing you to level up more, but this excuse felt extremely lame, and I felt like it was a chore to pad out the final stage of the game, which is weird because the game has so much content already, especially compared to the first game, which is half the length. Regardless, we get past the bridge, find out where the vault is, and make a final push for Jack. He taunts us the whole time, and we're able to make it to the vault with the help of Brick and Mordecai that sacrificed themselves for us. The atmosphere leading to the end is so good, and the sensory overload of the final push immediately met with the silence of entering the vault is just exquisite. The cinematics of the ending are satisfying, and once the warrior is defeated, we finally see the Handsome Jack mask come off, as he rants about how unfair it is that we won. We see that Jack's greatest downfall is that he truly believes he's the hero. Now this is something difficult to analyze because the pre-sequel really contextualizes why Jack thinks this way, and it's not ego, at least not entirely. Borderlands 3 also suggests that Jack's fate was out of his control the entire time. After his rant, we can kill him and see the face under the mask has been branded with the symbol of the vault. In a vacuum, this is a final indicator that there is something bigger out there and that indeed, Jack might be special. Brick and Mordecai come back and the crew uses the vault key to discover a map of other vaults across the galaxy. The game ends with the crew being determined to find the other vaults, and while the game wrapped up quickly, I was completely fine with it. There's a slight issue in that Roland's death wasn't properly explored, admittedly because there were other issues on the table, but the game does make right on that within its many DLCs. I think the game's story is great for what it sets out to do, which is entertain the player and encourage them to learn more about Pandora and get addicted to that grind. The grandiosity the game ends on, while not meeting the same heights of the first game, is still satisfying nonetheless, and aside from Chapter 18, there were no points I found myself not enjoying. Humor is going to be a make or break for something like this, and I can't comment on that too much because it is so unbelievably subjective. I know everything I've presented thus far is subjective, but the difference is I can offer very tangible reasons for why I feel the way I do, whereas humor is something that is so much harder to analyze. Do I think the game's still funny? Absolutely. Do I think its recent label of being poorly aged is accurate? Well, kinda. The kind of humor Borderlands presents is one of absurdity and overindulgence with a decent edge. That kind of humor hit well at the time, but times have changed. It's important to remember that a joke joke's reputation never stays the same. I still remember when shows like Rick and Morty were popular and people loved that kind of humor until one day they didn't. Now that show is looked at as being painfully unfunny. On the opposite end, we have shows like Family Guy that were once considered funny, then were seen as the show with nothing more than fart jokes, and now the show's perception in terms of how funny it is slowly changing. Who's to say the Borderlands series won't do the same thing in another 10 years? I think because of its art style, its humor that is mostly separated from the viral memes of the time, and for the strength of everything surrounding the story, Borderlands 2 will be remembered very fondly in another 10 years. It'll be seen as a quintessential 7th generation game. You know, this paragraph sounds like a conclusion to the whole video, but psych, the real game begins now! Borderlands 2 endgame content is, and I'm gonna get so much shit for this, where the game gets really good. I'm not saying the game finally gets good at hour 40, okay? The game is great all throughout, but it is where the game is at its best. Once you've dealt with the main story, you can start leveling up your character more, grinding the same guns over and over until you finally hit the jackpot, and start synergizing your gear with your skills. Once you have a character at max level, you can either start helping others or do it all again with a different character. It's hard to analyze because I think to some degree it really is as simple as being addicted to the grind. Even when I had nothing I particularly wanted from a boss, I would grind them a few times over just to see what I get, all in the name of loot. Once you hit Ultimate Vault Hunter mode, you'll have a higher chance of encountering things like loot midgets, which are normal enemies that can drop legendary gear. Certain bosses drop certain items, and there are even some challenges that are simply fun to keep doing over and over again. Much of my personal enjoyment came from helping other players do whatever they wanted. Especially as someone who prefers playing the Siren, being able to fulfill a support role was enjoyable. But we can't talk about post-game content without talking about the raid bosses. Once completing the main story, Borderlands 2 has one final task for you, but you'll notice that the requirement for this quest is much higher than your current level. This is what should motivate players to play the game again and get to level 50, and once doing so, you can head to Thousand Cuts, where you'll find an entrance to Terramorphous Peak, the home of a thresher so large, so dangerous, that the ancient civilization that created the vaults felt it necessary to contain it, seal it away from the rest of the world. You summon this colossal beast by blaring the horn to wake it from a gate meant to further contain it, and its movements send tremors throughout the mountains. Once it finally emerges, tentacles larger than the deadliest creatures on Pandora, you finally begin your assault like David against Goliath, and shit, you don't do a lot of damage. Well, this is the Borderlands endgame. Terramorphous is by all means meant to be fought with 4 players, and while beating them solo is possible, it's a tall order for most players. Personally, I think bosses like this should be fought with as many players as possible because the sense of camaraderie you get from tackling an insurmountable task together is so much fun, especially when you don't do it right the first time. It certainly isn't glamorous compared to other things you could be doing, but I really like tinkering with my friends and figuring out a good way for us to combine our abilities and weapons. Sometimes we would use glitches, sometimes we would just figure out how to get back to the boss faster using grenade jumps and whatnot, and that sense of cooperation isn't fulfilled by many games to the same extent. Now granted, there are still issues with this, such as balance with some of the bosses, but generally, the endgame grind and content is great, and rolling the dice for new weapons is equally such. But what if I told you you could roll the dice for bosses? Evolution is a beautiful thing. Varkids, a new class of enemy, all start out as babies, but give them a minute and they might turn into an adult. When entering the pod again, it'll produce a badass, then a super badass, and then an ultimate badass. But once in a while, a Varkid is chosen by the powers above to evolve into a supreme badass, ascending past the realm of any mere Varkid and becoming Vermivorous, the Invincible. And invincible it is, because fuck me, this thing hits you like a truck and you'd think the millions of bullets were tickling it. This boss has a ton of tension because now you don't simply submit a bit of iridium for the fight, you invested time, and in my case, a solid hour before any luck. This boss can only spawn in TVHM and UVHM, and has a higher spawn rate depending on how many players are in the lobby, but the odds still of a larval Varkid evolving into Vermivorous is a whopping 1% at most. I was lucky enough to take it down on my first go with a friend, but it was still a close call to say the least. He also dropped sweet fuck all, but hey, that's part of the process. But Borderlands was not satisfied with that. Throughout the many years, there were multiple DLC campaigns released, some of which were campaigns and others were called Headhunter Packs, which indicates a smaller setting and an excuse to give us another raid boss to start farming. We can't talk about the endgame without talking about these DLCs because what they offer is best understood when being in that endgame state. With each new DLC, there was an added raid boss or two and a slew of new weapons, weapons, some of which break the game in half, and all are a ton of fun. I won't go into too much detail on these because in both good and bad ways, the DLCs are just more Borderlands, and instead I want to focus on what makes each of them unique and how it contributes to the larger world of Pandora. When discussing the Headhunter packs, it's important to note the inconsistencies between them. On one hand, we fight a large snowman raid boss to save Christmas, which is clearly placing fun over lore, which is fine, but then we get the Son of Cromorax DLC, which has a ton of lore that explains where the crew is and what they're doing. This isn't a bad thing, especially when all the DLCs have enough fun to go around, but it makes me wonder which ones are canon or non-canon. Because if there's a large snowman just chilling on Pandora, I want to have an explanation for that. Let's leave the cold snow for a hot desert. And speaking of hot, the first DLC to be released is Captain Scarlet and her Pirate's Booty. This DLC features a slew of new areas and gives a humorous take on a pirate story within the Borderlands universe, and has a unique approach to a challenge with this kind of story. Despite this being a pirate adventure, you might notice there isn't any water. Having water in Borderlands 2 would create issues. Firstly, how would you traverse said water? By boat? What if the boat breaks? Do you die instantly? What if you find yourself stranded? They would need catch-a-rides everywhere. Instead, we play around the absence of water and still get the same feeling. All of Oasis, very funny, is without water, so instead the sea is a crater we dive into on sand skiffs. Instead of traversing around sharks, we avoid sandworms. There's still a sense of danger because if you lose your boat, you'll have to walk it back to shore, which serves the same purpose as swimming back to shore would. And the lack of water allows the final encounter to be against a Leviathan. This of course happens after we're introduced to the titular Captain Scarlet, who despite warning us of it the entire time, eventually betrays us. We race her to where the treasure is buried, but we're both eaten by Leviathan, and get to encounter a familiar boss from the first game, before fighting the Leviathan and exploring the game's first actual vault. I think this fight and ending to the DLC is solid enough, though not having an explanation for where Scarlet goes is disappointing. Furthering the disappointment are the two new raid bosses here, Hyperius the Invincible and Master Guy the Invincible. Both of these raid bosses have mechanics that actively extend their fight, which made them tedious to farm. This is less prevalent with Hyperius, but it especially ruins any chance of me farming Guy. I imagine this was done because fans were already finding ways to absolutely demolish the likes of Terramorphous, so the difficulty needed to be bumped up, which is fine, but making the fight take longer doesn't make it harder. In fact, Guy was probably the easiest fight in the game, despite it taking the longest of any by far. Hyperius has a few loaders that can activate shields if you hurt them too much, and can activate those shields for Hyperius. Not all shields can be active at once, so there's a strategy in terms of prioritizing targets. But despite the shields absorbing a lot of damage, they don't absorb all, meaning wise players can still find a way to end the fight very quickly if they're crafty enough. Guy, on the other hand, needs to be damaged by making him walk into pools of acid that slowly pop up around the map to drop his shield, at which point he goes down without issue. The problem with this fight is that there's no way to speed it up, aside from a glitch that skips the fight entirely. It makes farming him uninteresting, especially when Hyperius and Guy have no interesting lore behind them like Terramorphous does, and due to being human size, lack the grandeur of even the warrior or vermivorous. Something this DLC introduced are Seraph crystals, guardians, and a weapon rarity of the same name. These weapons are on the same tier as legendary, if not higher, and while not much is known about the Seraphs, I liked having new things to farm for. Seraph guardians are pretty much any raid boss that gain power through the opening of the vault, and that's all we're led to believe, which feels bare bones, but at least it gives people an excuse to farm the new bosses here, because it certainly won't be for the gameplay alone. Also, fun fact, Seraph is a word often used in Christian texts to define something that has been empowered by a deity. So the Seraph guardians being people that became legends after the vault opened, assumedly being touched by higher beings makes them even more badass. Overall, despite my gripes with Guy, the DLC provides great new content and an interesting new story, and continues the themes that made the base game so good. The same goes for the next DLC to be released, Mr. Torg's Campaign of Carnage. This DLC again stars the titular Torg, who is the embodiment of loud equals funny, and I hate to admit it, but yeah, it's pretty funny. It's a testosterone-filled adventure that sees a vault hunter competing in events around the badass creator of Badassitude to find the ultimate warrior capable of opening the vault within the Torg arena. In order to compete, we need a sponsor, but a competitor named Piston offers to do so, though it's clear he's going to betray us, which was a tiring trope given that Captain Scarlet did the same thing. Fortunately, the gag is put to rest as Piston betrays you immediately, and the rest of the DLC sees you being sponsored instead by Moxie, and eventually fighting Piston in his mech, the Badassosaurus. This fight sucks pretty hard. It's a massive damage sponge that has a few finite weak points, with nearly every attack being able to one-shot you, and every time I play this DLC I end up groaning the whole time. The fight against Piston afterwards is better, but the ending still disappoints as the vault is just an explosion of loot from the ground. Borderlands have set a standard up to this point that the vaults are going to be a somewhat mythical experience. This time you barely see the explosion before the credits pop out like a wet fart. Fortunately, the side quests are still decent enough, though many of them involve vehicles which, once you're in the endgame, don't scale well with the rest of the world, leading to most vehicles being made of glass, and thus any vehicle quests become tedious. At least a new raid boss, Pyro Pete the Invincible, is good. He fires streams of fire, go figure, and corroding acid that needs to be washed off by using the different showers around the arena. He definitely isn't the hardest boss, but he's quite fun and forgiving. Every so often, a few small spider ants will spawn, allowing anyone who's down to get a second wind, and Pete himself moves at a perfect speed to be a threat at all times, but not overly in your face. Where Pete lacks is again in the myth surrounding him. Pyro Pete is a boss fight during this campaign, and in order to summon the invincible version, we just press a button. I think he would have at least benefited from an updated title card or some kind of lore explaining that Pete, after his defeat, looked to Iridium and the Vault for more power, turning him into the raid boss we eventually fight. All in all, this DLC had a lot of the funnier moments, not just compared to the other expansions, but in regards to the rest of the game. I'm comfortable saying I was left impressed with it all. I cannot say the same about the Hammerlock DLC, which, while introducing some great environments and being much better in terms of the endgame challenges, has easily the most uninteresting story by far. Hammerlock is a fun character, but we don't learn anything new about him, and the antagonist, Professor Nakayama, was just annoying. What's worse is that the ending is once again underwhelming. Nakayama's defeat is funny, sure, but walking into his lab just for the credits to roll is so funny, and yet I'm not sure if it's intentional or not. Was it meant to be underwhelming? I don't know. Fortunately, this improves with the raid bosses this time around. Veracis the Invincible is, in my opinion, the hardest boss in the game by a country mile. I fought all the raid bosses on OP8 with a friend, and was able to get through all of them with a bit of elbow grease, but this was one that took ages for the two of us. And even when opening the lobby and having even more help, it was a nail biter to the last minute. At this point, we'll see a trend where the raid bosses really start requiring 4 people, which, as previously stated, isn't an issue, and truth be told, Veracitus can be killed solo. It just takes a stupid amount of setup. But if you thought his health bar was big, then you haven't met Deciduous, the Invincible, whose entire gimmick is at their damage sponge. Fortunately, the way you summon Deciduous is cool, having to light different totems around the map before it descends upon you, but the fight itself is a snooze, and the loot isn't anything to write home about either. I do wish that both of these raid bosses had more grandeur, but at this point, expecting anything else would be really foolish. But I should really throw all my expectations out the window, because the final DLC, Tiny Tina's Assault on Dragon Keep, is hands down the best expansion on offer, and here's why. The DLC looks entirely different. Most of the expansions had new environments and enemies, I'm not trying to discredit that, but Dragon Keep has not a single reused asset. Everyone has new outfits, new vending machines, and they even revamped a critical part of the gameplay loop, gambling. Now when coming across certain chests, you can open it and roll a dice to decide the rarity of the loot inside, or you can roll 2 of them at the cost of some Iridium, to double your odds at getting good loot. With each iteration, we're just likening the game more and more to a proper slot machine, but don't worry, there's a good plot here too. The game takes place within a fictional session of bunkers and badasses, the Borderlands equivalent of Dungeons and Dragons. Tiny Tina is the bunker master this time around, but as the adventure goes on, she keeps bringing up characters from the main game that should be left to rest. As the story goes on, the team grows increasingly frustrated, but eventually she reveals that the reason these characters are alive in her story is because she's so racked with grief that even if it is pretending, she wants them to have a happier ending. Bloodwing and Roland were by all means robbed of a hero's death, shot in the back or brutally dismembered. In her world, it doesn't have to be that way. I don't mean to present the story as being that serious, it truly isn't, all the way from the many times Tina has to change the rules because the Vault Hunters keep complaining to the princess who turns out to be Butt Stallion, a joke that has admittedly grown on me. The game does a lot with the D&D setting, and overall I just love this expansion for being the perfect balance of new and fresh content, but not abandoning the core themes of the game. Thankfully, the quality extends to the raid boss, which is given all the grandeur I want from the moment it's introduced.
Raid boss! Meow, 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 meow. Get 3 other friends or you'll die! Meow, 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 meow.
To the explosion once they're finally defeated. The 4 dragons are one of the tougher fights, and another I was incapable of doing on my own. Each dragon has an ability, reflecting bullets and creating hazards on the map, leveling up other dragons, healing other dragons, and one just kinda does some damage. Figuring out the most effective order to take out the dragons and what their quirks are was fun, though I do wish their different differences were explained a bit more. The dragons have a mechanic where they become resistant once landed to whatever element was used against someone in the air, and I had no idea this was a thing until I looked it up. Regardless, this felt like a relatively fair, epic, grandiose battle that I found a lot of joy in farming, and the loot was solid here. I realize I've said the loot is either good or bad, and what I mean by this is, did I feel adequately rewarded for taking down an enemy? If there's an explosion of cash, iridium, and of course a legendary once in a while, I'm happy. If I take down a colossal foe and my reward is a limp dick loot explosion, chances are I won't be farming them again. When it comes to farming bosses, most of my time was spent in the bite-sized expansions released between the bigger ones, referred to as headhunter packs. These packs revolve around a central boss intended to be fought over and over, and most of them are pretty good, with some being more fun than the full-fledged DLCs. These typically feature different holidays or seasons, but don't offer a ton in the way of stories. This doesn't mean they aren't fun. The Mercenary Day pack and the Cromarax expansion are some of my favorites, but just don't expect anything more than an excuse for more jokes. Gags like the 2 Goliaths accidentally raging because they took their helmets off in an attempt to kiss was really weirdly funny, and the entire Mr. Torg DLC was solid too. What these Headhunter packs offer most is variety. When my Borderlands obsession was at its peak, I had a large rotation of bosses to farm that were all aesthetically and mechanically different, and while that isn't much, it led to Borderlands 2 having an incredibly strong endgame. It's standard fare with hints of what is happening post-campaign. The Son of Cromarak's expansion shows that the crew are as tight as ever, and Mordecai has even adopted a new bird, and while it isn't much, it's all we get until the pre-sequel, which even then, as the name implies, doesn't tell us much more. But this isn't where the story ends, as 7 years after the game's initial release, we got one final DLC, Commander Lilith and the Fight for Sanctuary. Taking place after the main campaign, this expansion tries to fill the gaps between this game and Borderlands 3, and while I enjoyed it a lot, I don't know how necessary it is. By the end of the game, the crew is largely the same as they were before, except now Lilith heads the Crimson Raiders, and the vault key is missing, which doesn't, as far as I'm aware, matter in the grand scheme of things. As far as the crew is concerned, things haven't changed. Roland and Brick had a falling out previously because Brick and Roland disagreed on their respective brutality, but Lilith now fills this role in the same way Roland did. On one hand, I could see this as an attempt to show Lilith paying tribute to the way Roland handled things, but on the other, it feels like with her essentially acting as he did, not much has changed. The story opens with Sanctuary being invaded by an ex-Dahl personnel who's bringing with him a nasty virus that acts as both an interesting plot device and a gameplay mix-up. Within gameplay, the gas clouds will quickly kill you, but if within it, you'll do increased damage, so there's an added layer of positioning to the otherwise normal gameplay that made this DLC a ton of fun. What this new flora-based pathogen introduces is an excuse for Borderlands to environmentally do what it does best, which is create a hostile, oppressive environment with a code of beauty on top. New enemies are introduced too, but never did much to challenge, though it didn't need to. The new bosses were fun, specifically Uranus, and the fight against Hector made for a good cinematic climax. The story ends with Sanctuary being destroyed and Lilith officially taking over as the commander of the Raiders. After a post-credits scene, we see that the vault key is somewhere in the wasteland, and after that, credits roll. All in all, this DLC was significantly better than anything before it, barring maybe the Tina expansion. And what struck me most about it was how cinematic a lot of it was. Fight for Sanctuary was by all means a teaser for Borderlands 3, and if you played that game, then you know the production value of the story took a massive leap forward. And even in the now primitive Borderlands 2 framework, that effort is seen and appreciated. This really does feel like the next step in the Borderlands series, but amazingly, it still pales in comparison to what Borderlands 3 would feature mechanically. Story-wise, that's another issue, but even the characters here, like Tiny Tina, who normally make me want to vomit, are done well enough that I looked forward to seeing them more. The humor as a whole was much the same, but it's here that we're introduced to Vaughn, a character from Tales from the Borderlands, who I swear to God drives me up the fucking wall. Every time he speaks, I feel like I'm gonna spontaneously pop a fucking blood vessel. Despite this, I enjoyed this expansion the most of all the DLCs. It had the most interesting environments, the best boss fights, and a story that actually felt like it furthered the plot, even if by a little bit. But of course, you know the real reason I bought this expansion: the loot and the raid boss. This time around, we fight a giant sandworm named Hatterax, the Invincible. What makes this foe formidable is not just the insane damage it does, the insane damage it takes, or for the fact that for most of the fight it is damn near invulnerable, which I guess does explain the name. It's that every attempt costs 20 iridium. Most raid bosses cost 20 iridium to fight, but if you die, you can retry for free. Hatterax is not so kind, which is a little nuts considering how much of a fight they put up. The trick is to hit their weak point on their head, but they move around so much and tower above you so hard that its weak point is difficult to nail. Fortunately, every time Hatterax comes up through the ground, a shockwave will shoot up out of some craters around the map, allowing you to reach a high enough vantage point to hit the crit and stun them, opening them up to deal significant damage. I had a ton of fun learning this new enemy, and the soundtrack to the fight was just stellar, but the real prize is the loot at the end. The frequency of high-level, high-rarity loot on offer is downright insane, and after farming Hatterax a few times, I was always happy to see at least one cool weapon I wanted to try. But you may notice that there's something new here: effervescent loot. This rainbow loot is above the legendary tier and offers unique effects when paired with other rainbow gear. For example, the hard carry when paired with the easy mode will make a specific challenge easier, which, while a very niche use, got me excited to try said challenge. I do worry that Borderlands might be giving us too much loot though. I mean, with the DLCs in mind, there are 8 different tiers of loot, half of those tiers attempting to reach a coveted status, so I hope that going forward we just keep legendaries as the legendaries. The problem isn't that there are too many guns, it's that when legendaries and above drop so frequently, it loses a bit of its luster. This applies more to Borderlands 3, so I'll save the lecture about rare weapon economy stuff, but for now, I want to say that Commander Lilith and the Fight for Sanctuary was an excellent way to cap off Borderlands 2, and was a cherry on top of a game that had already cemented itself as one of the best looter shooters of its time. So my overarching question that informed a lot of what I focused on here was, has Borderlands 2 aged poorly? Is it still good? After 12 years, were we incorrect to call it a masterclass? My answer is obvious. Not a chance. While I think there is merit to the idea that the humor is of its time, it's hard to call it poorly aged because so many of the jokes still land, and when experienced in the wider context of the game, work well. I think we can sometimes forget how much context matters. Have you ever told a story about something unbelievably funny, and then as you get to the punchline, you realize that your audience isn't resonating with it, and you reflexively blurt out a, "Man, you just had to be there." And you do that because it's true. Sometimes a joke on paper isn't good, but when it's experienced within a surrounding vibe and atmosphere, it can turn into something hilarious. A secondary issue with evaluating humor is that it is impossible to do so with tangible examples. If I want to say I like the gameplay of the game, I can point to different things it does, how it reflects the themes of the world, and myriad other examples that, while not proving the point objectively, communicate effectively why I feel the way I do. You can't quite do that with humor because our enjoyment of it is so subjective, and it's difficult to pin down the exact reasons a joke works or doesn't work. If a joke doesn't land and we decide it's because it's offensive, we have to unpack why it's offensive. Why do we think offensive topics don't belong in humor, and so on. If people find Shooty McShootface a stupid joke, asking them why isn't going to yield anything. Now, this isn't because I'm convinced people hate fun or that their taste isn't as refined as mine, but it's because it either works or it doesn't, and there isn't always a reason why. Games like Borderlands fall victim to most current social media trends. Most websites have a character limit, and most people don't want to find the nuance of why a product works or doesn't. So instead of watching the admittedly self-indulgent hour-long video that has a 90% chance of being a plot summary, they opt for a 20-second clip and a tweet saying the game sucks or that it's still a masterpiece. If Borderlands 2 existed only in the short clips online, then yeah, this game's ass. But when we zoom out, look at everything on offer, we see a game that's strongest asset isn't even the thing that's most discussed. Borderlands 2 was a game that held on to a long-time fan base, and it didn't do so by hoping players still laughed at a fictional horse named Butt Stallion for the 20th playthrough. They did it by creating a world and a gameplay loop that was as addicting as it was gorgeous. Borderlands 2 is a game that you play for the gameplay. You play it for the grind, for trying new characters, for trying new builds, for rolling that slot machine once more in hopes of a legendary. The world, the story, the jokes. That's all a way of buttering you up so you get addicted to that gameplay loop by the end of the first playthrough. This isn't to say Borderlands doesn't have interesting stories to tell, or that everything surrounding the gameplay is done without passion or without exceptional skill, but that grinding for loot and fighting bosses over and over is an acquired taste. And I believe the pipeline Borderlands puts you down is a very meticulously crafted one. I think any Borderlands game is difficult to talk about because every aspect of the game has so much depth that there is simply too much to say. This video is over an hour long, and yet I feel as though I've barely scratched the surface. Hell, I haven't mentioned the two characters released post-launch, Krieg and Gage. I haven't mentioned the idea of overpowered levels, and truthfully, I won't. If I were to spend my time talking about the individual builds, the lore behind everything, I'd end up describing the tiniest fraction of the game, and I don't believe that adequately communicates what works here. That's why my coverage of the DLCs was relatively short, because while there is a lot here, it follows or strengthens the themes of the base game. So while there is a lot of stuff I didn't talk about, it's because a game as big as this, analysis-wise, runs the risk of turning into a video of describing guns and summarizing lore. It's also hard to not say that Borderlands 2 captured lightning in a bottle. Every Borderlands game has its strengths. The first game had great world building, the third had excellent gunplay and presentation, the pre-sequel has great sci-fi elements, but Borderlands 2 really has it all, and in spades. I've seen talks from fans asking for a Borderlands 2 remake, and truthfully, why the fuck is that necessary? The game's right here. It looks good. It plays well. Why do we need to do it all again? Especially when doing so runs the risk of missing what made the game so good in the first place. I'd much rather we keep pushing onwards with new entries, because if the series had proven anything with its multiple entries to this point, it's that there's no shortage of ideas. Something I cannot omit in a piece explaining how this game got the legacy it did was the community. The Borderlands community during the time of this game was amazing. We had so many personalities working together, and while the release of Borderlands 3 has resulted in that community being fractured, toxic, and otherwise lame as fuck, I can still appreciate what it used to be. Borderlands 2 made it abundantly easy to become part of the community, because when half of the endgame bosses required 4 or more people, cooperating with strangers and forming a bond over running the same bosses over and over was a necessity to success, and thus there was an incentive to be kind to one another. I think the lack of a PvP mode ensured this further, as there were less competitions in regards to who's the strongest, and let's be real, it would also be a balancing nightmare. I played Borderlands 2 throughout most of my teenage years. This game, its community, and its accessible camaraderie were there for me when I felt like no one else was. This game was ultimately my safe space for a long time. It was familiar in a time where life was throwing nothing but curveballs. I know that's not a strong argument, but it really is a big reason as to why the game stuck with me for so long, and why I played it so long. This dangerous, unpredictable world was ironically comforting. Years later, that world is only better for the memories within it. Pandora isn't just the place of vaults, but of memories for myself and I'm sure many others. This was a place where people made friends, a place where people made memories. I don't care if it's nostalgia I don't care if it's bias. That's what it was, and what it still is. And that never ages. Hello everyone, thank you for watching this video. This was a deeply personal video because, I mean, as I explained in the video itself, I've been a massive fan of Borderlands for so long. And so finally being able to actually talk about the game was really good. I made this video because the Borderlands movie is out, and with it there's kind of been a resurgence in people getting into the series and whatnot, and I thought if there's ever time for me to make a Borderlands video and it has any semblance of getting more than 100 views, now's the time. So next video is going to be X-Men Origins Wolverine, and then after that, I promise, it'll be Spider-Man 2. Okay, I'm working on Spider-Man 2. I'm just taking my time with it because, you know, it's not a complicated game, but the discourse around it is complicated, and so I want to approach it with a lot of care. Anyways, if you want to see any more videos from me, you guys know where to find it. I have playlists all over the channel for you. You can follow me on Twitter for video updates. You can also support me on Patreon, and you'll have your name appear on screen next to these cool guys. Look at them. Aren't they cool? Come on. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you for everything you guys do for me. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you want to see more, okay? Because if this does well, oh my god, I'm gonna be so excited because I'm gonna talk about the rest of the Borderlands games. It's gonna be fucking awesome. Because I think what I have to say about Borderlands is not entirely encapsulated in this video. I definitely have a lot of thoughts on the first game, decent amount on the pre-sequel, and I got a lot to say about the third. So if you want to see that, let me know, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for everything. Take care of yourselves. I love you guys, and see you later.